a shattered clock, a vanished man, and silence where ticking should be. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Tell me, where in the world are you unraveling this case from? Your comments bring these mysteries to life. Let's begin. The rain had not stopped since morning. It wasn't heavy, just persistent, that steady, whispering drizzle that blurred the windows of the Quai des Orfèvres and left a cold mist clinging to the skin. Chief Inspector Maigret sat at his desk, not reading the file in front of him, not thinking particularly about anything. The radiator hissed faintly. Outside, a tram rattled along the embankment. He held his pipe but hadn't lit it. Madame Maigret had started using a new soap for his shirts. Lavender, she'd said. And now each time he lifted his arm or shifted in the chair, the scent floated up at him, oddly out of place among the smells of old paper, tobacco, and damp wool. He didn't dislike it. He just noticed it, the way he noticed the stain on the ceiling tile or the chip in his mug. It was all part of the same quiet rhythm. The office door was ajar. Across the corridor, Inspector Lognon trudged past in his eternal state of annoyance, his coat already damp, his face drawn in permanent grievance. Maigret watched him go without comment. Nothing urgent today. No ringing telephones, no bodies in the canal, no reporters sniffing around. A day like any other, or so it would seem. He stood and crossed to the window. Across the river, the spire of Saint-Chapelle vanished intermittently behind the passing clouds of mist and chimney smoke. The city seemed to be holding its breath. Then came the knock. Soft, uncertain. It was young Lapointe, still fresh-faced, despite the years under Maigret's watch. He looked uncomfortable, too respectful by half, which usually meant something odd had come in, something not quite serious enough to warrant a fuss, yet curious enough to bring upstairs. "There's a man downstairs," Chief Lapointe said. "Won't sit, won't take coffee. He didn't ask for a lawyer. Says he doesn't need one." Maigret nodded, not speaking yet. "Says something's wrong at the Rue des Tours. Says he found something in the back room of the clockmaker's shop." "Found what?" Lapointe hesitated. He didn't say, only that it wasn't his place to touch it. Just that, ... He thinks someone should come look. Maigret lit his pipe. Slowly. "What's his name?" "Jules No. Said he helps out with deliveries there sometimes. Doesn't have a fixed address, but the men downstairs know him. Seems harmless." "Did he say whose workshop it was?" "A.M. Reber. Clockmaker, retired mostly, keeps odd hours, lives in the back of the shop, according to Turneau." Maigret turned back toward the desk and tamped down the tobacco in his pipe with the broad, slow finger of his thumb. Rue des Tours. He hadn't been there in years. A dull stretch of the 11th arrondissement pale buildings, cracked pavements, a neighborhood too quiet for its own good. He reached for his coat, still damp from the morning. "Let's have a look." As they stepped outside, the rain resumed its quiet drumbeat. Paris, even in greyness, never seemed entirely asleep. There were the familiar smells: wet stone, coal smoke, the acrid temps of frying oil from a basement. Restaurant. Maigret walked without speaking, Lapointe beside him, umbrellas useless against the slanting mist. He wasn't thinking about the clockmaker's shop. Not yet. He was watching the streets, the faces behind fogged cafe windows, the old woman dragging her cart across a puddle. It was always the same in the beginning. The facts would come later, the theories after that. But first came the feeling, the weather in the bones, the tension in the air. The moment when something ordinary stopped feeling quite right, and Rue des Trois, he suspected, would not be ordinary for much longer. Rue des Trois was one of those streets. Maigret had passed through more times than he could count without ever quite remembering it. Narrow, slightly crooked, and lined with pale facades that hadn't seen fresh paint in years. It carried the subdued air of a place suspended in quiet decay. Laundry hung limp from windows. A cat slunk under a bench. The rain, still whispering from the sky, darkened the cobblestones and muffled the footsteps of the few passers-by. The workshop was halfway down the street, wedged between a shuttered tobacconist and a locksmith whose display window was cluttered with dull brass keys and a dusty imitation pistol. The sign above the door read simply, R. Ribeyrol, Horloger. The paint was faded. The bell above the door jangled softly as Maigret pushed it open. Inside, the warmth was immediate but stale, scented with old wood, metal filings, and that curious, sour temps of disuse. Clocks of every shape lined the walls. Cuckoos, pendulums, carriage clocks with flaking enamel. Most were silent. Only a few ticked, faintly, like the last remnants of a heartbeat in a once lively room. Behind the counter stood Jules Turneau. If stood was the right word. He shifted uneasily from foot to foot, a narrow man with a drawn face and wet hair slicked to his forehead. His jacket was too thin for the weather, and one cuff was frayed to threads. He nodded quickly when Maigret entered, glancing once at Lapointe, but then focusing entirely on the inspector. "You're the one who called?" Maigret asked, voice low, almost indifferent. Turneau nodded. "Yes, Chief. I didn't know who else. I mean, I didn't touch anything. Didn't feel right." Maigret didn't rush him. He walked slowly around the shop, not looking at the man, but taking in the details, the cracked glass in a wall clock, a broken mainspring on the workbench, the small tin of coffee grounds tucked beside a pile of winding keys. All quiet, all ordinary, and yet ... He turned. "Where is M. Ribeyrol?" Turneau's eyes flicked to a narrow hallway at the back. "That's where he lives. In the rear, I didn't see him all day. Usually he's up early, opens the front. By 9, I had a delivery this morning, some parts from Montrouge. The front was unlocked, but he wasn't here. I called out, thought maybe he was in the back, but ... He stopped. The door to his rooms was open. I looked in, that's when I thought better call someone." Maigret nodded. "Show me." Turneau hesitated, then led them down the hall. The passage narrowed, lined with wooden paneling that had warped with age. A damp chill seeped from the walls. At the end was a plain door, slightly ajar. Turneau stopped just before it and stepped. Aside, Maigret entered. The room beyond was dark, the curtains still drawn. Maigret stepped in quietly, Lapointe just behind. The space was cramped, a low ceiling, faded wallpaper, a narrow iron-framed bed with an old wool blanket neatly tucked. There was no sign of struggle, nothing overturned, nothing obvious, but in the corner, next to a pot-bellied stove, an armchair faced the wall. A pair of thick-soled slippers sat at its feet. Maigret crossed to it. Ribeyrol was seated, head slumped sideways, as though he'd simply dozed off mid-thought. His right hand dangled at his side. A small, half-filled glass of Mark sat on the side table, untouched. But the unnatural stillness in the room, the cold that clung to the man's fingers, told a different story. Maigret bent closer, eyes narrowing. No sign of violence, no blood, but the skin was waxy. And there, barely visible beneath the high collar of his nightshirt, A faint discoloration on the neck. A bruise. No, not quite. He didn't speak, didn't declare anything. Instead, he straightened slowly and looked around the room. A book lay open on the bed. Le Petit Journal Illustre. The clock on the mantel had stopped at 2:47. A single shoe lay beneath the bed, its mate carefully placed beside the door. Lapointe stepped forward, but Maigret raised a hand. "Don't touch anything." He turned to Turno, who lingered at the threshold. "You say the door was open?" Turno nodded. "Yes, Chief, just like that. I didn't. I didn't hear anything strange. I thought maybe he was sleeping." Maigret studied the man's face. There was something genuine about the discomfort, the way he kept his eyes averted, the way he rubbed the back of his neck. If he was lying, it was the kind of lie born not of guilt, but of fear. "You work for him?" "Not really. I help sometimes. Deliveries, errands." He paid cash. Mostly kept to himself. "Anyone else come here often?" Turno hesitated. "Not that I know of. There was a woman, maybe once or twice a week, early, before opening. Not young, always wore gloves. Didn't speak much. I don't know her name." Maigret gave a slight nod. "Describe her. Short, grey hair. The kind of coat you notice expensive, you know. Didn't match the rest of this place." Lapointe scribbled quietly in his notebook. Maigret turned back to the room. "Did M. Ribeiro have family?" "None," he talked about. "Just the clocks." Turno gave a weak smile, as if trying to lighten the moment. It failed. The rain had thickened outside, now tapping harder against the windows. "Call Dr. Paul. Tell him to come here directly," Maigret said over his shoulder to Lapointe. "And no noise about this. Not yet." The younger man nodded and stepped out. Maigret remained a moment longer, watching the scene. The stillness had weight, the kind that didn't come from death alone, but from something left unsaid, a silence that stretched beyond the room, like a breath being held. As he left the back room, Maigret paused at the workshop again. One of the clocks had begun to tick, faintly off rhythm. He watched the hands stutter forward. There was no official cause yet, no accusation, but he felt it. That subtle pressure in the air, the soft wrongness that often came before the facts, revealed themselves. Not a case, not yet. Just a man in a chair, and a mystery quiet enough to make the clocks seem loud out on the street. The cat was still there, now curled on a windowsill, tail flicking lazily. Across the way, an old woman swept water from her doorstep, more out of habit than hope. Maigret lit his pipe again and stood in the doorway, watching the rain slide down the shop's sign like tears from a name. The medical examiner arrived just before noon. Dr. Paul was a narrow man, precise in movement and thought, his spectacles always slipping down his nose. He said little, nodded briefly to Maigret, and disappeared into the back room with his case in hand. Maigret remained in the workshop, seated behind the counter in the chair Ribeiro must have used. He filled his pipe again, tamped it down slowly. The clocks ticked out of sync. Somewhere in the far wall, a cuckoo cried once and fell silent. Lapointe returned from the call box, hair slicked with rain, his collar soaked. "Dr. Paul says it's likely poison," he said. "Barbiturates, maybe. He'll confirm later. Number wounds. Nothing forced. Quiet." Maigret nodded, his eyes on a dent in the counter's edge. He didn't fight, no, any sign of a glass or bottle. Just the glass of Mark, half finished. Paul took it. Maigret leaned back. Too easy, he murmured, almost to himself. Lapointe looked puzzled. He was a clockmaker, Maigret said. Someone who measured life in gears and ticks. If he meant to kill himself, he would have done it neatly. Left the place in order. Notes, lists, receipts in place. He stood, moving slowly to the glass display case where antique watch faces were arranged like little pale moons. No suicide note, nothing, Lapointe replied. Room was tidy, bed made, no sign of hurrying or struggle. Outside, a tram passed, rattling the windows. The rain had slowed to a thin drizzle again, fine and lingering. Maigret stepped outside, lighting his pipe with a match cupped against the wind. The air was heavy, wet, and smelled faintly of coal and rain damp. Stone. Across the street, a door opened. A woman, middle-aged, in a plain dress, stepped out to fetch something from a metal pail. Maigret watched her, then crossed the street. Bonjour, madame. She turned, surprised, eyeing the badge he showed without ceremony. Madame Collard, she said. I run the boarding house. He nodded toward the workshop. You knew M. Ribeiro, only to say, good morning, quiet man. Lived alone, never caused trouble. Did anyone visit him regularly? She hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron. There was a woman, short, proper, never stayed long. Always left early in the morning, before most people were up. Do you know her name? No, I assumed they were family. Sister, maybe, though, ... She lowered her voice. Sometimes it looked like she'd been crying. Maigret studied the woman's face, honest, lined with years of other people's stories. What did she wear? A grey coat, gloves, always gloves, even in warm weather. He nodded. Thank you. Back inside, Lapointe was flipping through a small address book found in the drawer. Maigret took it, turning each page slowly. Most names were old customers, not many, and none stood out. But near the back, scrawled in the margin, was a name, Mademoiselle Lemoyne. No number, no address, just a first initial and a date. Twos. He tapped the page. Look into this. Yes, Chief. Maigret's gaze shifted again toward the back room. He felt no excitement, no urgency, only that sense, the one he had trusted all these years, that something remained just below the surface. Waiting for the light dot by early afternoon, a patrolman brought word. Someone had come to the station. A woman, asking, not too loudly, about Ribeiro. She didn't give her name. Chief, the officer said, but she fits the description. Grey coat, gloves. Maigret exchanged a glance with Lapointe, then reached for his hat. The interview room at the Quai or Favors was not intimidating. It wasn't meant to be. A plain wooden table, 2 chairs, a window that overlooked the grey Seine. When Maigret entered, the woman was already seated, gloves folded neatly in front of her like a confession. She was perhaps 50, hair greying but well kept, in that careful way of women who had once cared deeply about appearances and now did so out of habit. Her handbag rested in her lap. She looked up calmly when Maigret entered. I understand you're inquiring about M. Ribeiro. She nodded once. Is he? Maigret didn't answer immediately. He removed his coat, shook the rain from it, and sat down across from her. Can you tell me your name, Madame? Claire Lemoyne. You visited him often? Yes, she said it without hesitation, but her eyes remained fixed on her gloves. Were you family? No, lovers. A slight flinch. Her lips pressed together. Once, she said softly. A long time ago. Then what? We parted. I married. He didn't. You still came here. Not often. Not until ... this past year. Why then? She met his eyes for the first time. He wrote to me, said he was ill, that he didn't want to die alone. Margaret leaned back, watching her. What did you talk about? Mostly nothing. The past, the clocks. Did he speak of ending his life? No. She paused. Not directly. You saw him yesterday. She hesitated. Yes. What time did you leave? Shortly after 8. Was he well? He was ... tired, but calm. Did he drink? He poured himself a glass of mark. I didn't touch it. Margaret lit his pipe, letting the silence sit. She didn't fidget, didn't rush to fill the space. That too told him something. Did he ask you for anything? Her mouth tightened. He asked me to stay, and you refused. I told him I couldn't. My husband thinks. He thinks I go to Mass. Margaret said nothing. The rain against the window had stopped. Only the sound of distant footsteps echoed through the hallway. You loved him still. Yes, enough to help him die. A beat, then two. The silence bloomed, heavy. I don't know, she said finally. He looked at me with those eyes. I thought he was going to ask, but he didn't, and I left. Margaret nodded slowly. You didn't see anyone else there? No. He stood, moving to the window. The river moved sluggishly beneath the grey sky. Thank you, Mademoiselle Lemoyne. That's all for now. She didn't move immediately, but then she rose, gathered her gloves, and left without another word. Margaret watched her go, the door closing softly behind her. Lapointe appeared a few moments later. What do you think, Chief? Margaret didn't answer. He was staring at the window pane, where a small smear of condensation had gathered in the corner. I think, he said at last, that it's too quiet. He turned. We're not done yet. The rain had finally stopped by the time Margaret stepped back into the Rue des Trois Bornes. The sun made no effort to return. The sky remained. A flat, indifferent grey, but the stillness had changed. The gutters no longer ran with water. The stones of the pavement gave off a faint, earthy smell. He paused outside the shop, his coat collar turned up, and stood for a long moment, simply watching the front window. The clocks inside were still ticking, not all of them, but enough to create a soft, uneven rhythm, like a room full of people breathing at different tempos. Lapointe joined him on the sidewalk. I checked Mademoiselle Lemoyne's background, he said. She lives in the 14th Rue Boissonade, married to a retired civil servant. No children, quiet life, no debt, no record. Margaret nodded, unsurprised. She's telling the truth, or most of it. Lapointe hesitated. You think she killed him? No, Margaret said simply. She was grieving. She might have known he wanted to die. She might have even considered helping him. But she didn't do it. She's the kind who wears gloves to drink coffee. They entered the shop again. The air inside was heavier now, the warmth slightly oppressive. Dr. Paul had finished his preliminary work. The body had been removed. Only a faint smell of camphor and something bitter, perhaps the ghost of the poison, lingered in the back rooms. Lingered in the back rooms. It did not go to the rear this time. Instead, he stood behind the counter, gazing at the wall of timepieces. His fingers brushed against the edge of the wood, and he frowned. There's something strange here, he murmured. Not in what we found, but in what's missing. Lapointe looked at him. Missing. Margaret gestured toward the back. He was found in his chair, yes. Glass of mark on the side table. Everything in its place. Everything to clean. Lapointe. Eyes narrowed slightly, thinking. Maigret stepped around the counter and knelt beside a small cabinet near the cash register. He opened it. Tools, precision ones, lay arranged neatly in a wooden tray. Below them, a drawer with labeled vials of clock oil, cleaning fluid, and varnish. He lifted one and held it under his nose, then replaced it. Have you ever noticed how varnish smells after it dries? A bit sharp, chemical. Exactly, and yet the whole place smells faintly of it, as if someone used it recently. But none of the clocks look newly treated. Lapointe shrugged. Could be old residue, or part of his normal work. Maigret didn't answer. Instead, he moved toward the rear hallway, stopping halfway, where a coat rack stood. A long black overcoat hung there reberolles. The pockets were empty, but Maigret noticed something near the hem. A faint splash of a darker shade, barely perceptible on the wall. He touched it, then brought his fingers to his nose. The same bitter chemical scent. Not varnish, something else. He looked at Lapointe. Get the lab to check that stain. Yes. Chief Maigret stepped into the workshop again, this time peering more closely at the wall of clocks. He stared at them as if they were guests at a party who had said just a little too much. His eyes lingered on a narrow, ornate pendulum clock tucked into the far corner. Did you notice this one? He asked. Lapointe shook his head. It's not working. The pendulum is stopped, and there's a key left inside. He reached in and turned the key slowly. The clock didn't resist. It had already been wound. He examined the face. The hands pointed to 2:47, the same time as the clock in the back room. Lapointe stepped forward, so he kept both clocks stopped at the same time. No, Maigret said. I don't think he did. He pointed to a fine scratch on the minute hand. That's fresh. Someone reset this clock to match the other. Lapointe frowned. Why would they do that? To make it seem like the time of death matched the other clock. A detail for atmosphere. Maigret looked around the room. The strange quietness wasn't just about death. It was about design. Someone had arranged this, not hurriedly, but with an obsessive neatness. Someone wanted us to see a tidy death, Maigret murmured. They cleaned, adjusted, perhaps even varnished to hide fingerprints, but they didn't know clocks. Not the way Reberol did. Lapointe made a note. So, not Mademoiselle Lemoyne. No, Maigret said. She wouldn't have dared touch his clocks. A thought passed over his face, like a shadow moving across a still lake. Bring Turno back in. Lapointe raised his eyebrows. You think? Just bring him. Jules Turno arrived an hour later, looking more nervous than before. He had changed his shirt, but not his coat, and his shoes were still scuffed with rain and street dirt. He sat stiffly in the chair, Maigret indicated, fingers tapping a distracted rhythm on his knee. I've got a few more questions for you, Monsieur Turno. Of course, Chief. Maigret didn't begin with questions. He lit his pipe, blew, smoke toward the corner of the room. Turno watched him, eyes shifting slightly. You said you helped with deliveries, Maigret began. Yes. How often? Once or twice a week. Sometimes more if he needed parts picked up. You ever work on the clocks yourself? Turno shook his head. No, sir, I wouldn't dare. Too delicate. Maigret tapped his pipe. You know what varnish smells like? Turno blinked. What? Varnish? Or cleaning fluid? You notice any smells when you came in? I maybe, not really. The place always smells a bit strange. Maigret leaned forward. You touched one of the clocks. The one in the corner. You tried to set it to match the one in the back room. Turno stiffened. I don't know what you mean. No, no, sir. I didn't touch anything. Maigret paused, then asked, almost casually, did Ribeyrol owe you money? Turno didn't answer at first. His eyes dropped. I helped him out sometimes, he said, finally. More than just deliveries. I'd clean the place, run errands. He paid me when he could. And lately, Turno shrugged. He hadn't paid me in weeks. Said he was broke. Maigret nodded slowly. Did you come in early this morning? No. You were seen entering before 8. Turno looked up sharply. No, I swear. I only came round 10. That's when I found Maigret didn't press him. He sat back, letting the silence do its work. After a while, Turno shifted again, uneasily. I didn't kill him. Never said you did. I saw him, there, in the chair. And I knew it didn't look right. So I straightened up a few things. Wiped the glass. I didn't want it to look like a robbery. Why would it look like a robbery? Turno paused. I don't know. I panicked. Maigret studied him. The lies weren't clever. They were panicked, instinctive. The kind that come from someone who's afraid of being blamed. He stood. That'll be all for now, Monsieur Turno. But stay nearby. Turno nodded quickly and left without waiting. Lapointe exhaled. He's hiding something. Yes, Maigret said. But it may not be the murder. He walked back to the clocks. One of them had stopped ticking again. Outside, the street was growing dark. There was someone else. Someone no one had seen yet. The varnish was still fresh, and the silence, Maigret felt, had just begun to crack. That evening, Maigret returned to the Rue des Trois Bornes alone. He didn't tell Lapointe. He didn't tell anyone. It wasn't secrecy, not really, more a matter of rhythm. Investigations had their own tempo, and this one demanded a kind of silence. A presence. The air was different now. As night began to gather, cooler, but still damp, and the slick stones of the pavement caught the glow of the street lamps like dull mirrors. The workshop was locked, but the keys had been left at the precinct. Maigret let himself in, closing the door quietly behind him. He didn't switch on the lights. Instead, he stood in the shadows, letting his eyes adjust. He was not looking for evidence. Not in the usual sense. He had no fingerprint kit, no photographs. What he wanted, what he waited for, was the room to speak. It did, eventually. Not with words, but with smells and sounds and absences. There was the faint ticking of the clocks, fewer than in the day, like a house slowly falling asleep. The scent of oil and wood. And then something else, almost hidden, a draft. A subtle one, but insistent, drawing across the floor from the rear of the shop. He followed it, back through the corridor, past the little kitchen where a half-used jar of mustard stood beside a tin of stale biscuits, into the room where Ribeyrol had died. Here, Maigret paused. His eyes moved to the window above the armchair, a narrow, old-fashioned casement with warped glass and peeling paint. A pane had been wiped recently. Just a single patch, the size of a hand, cleaned roughly in the middle of the otherwise fogged-over surface. Someone had looked out, or looked in. He examined it carefully. No fingerprints now, just the suggestion of where skin had met glass. He sat in the dead man's chair and leaned forward. Through that small, cleared patch, he could see a rear courtyard cracked pavement, a broken wooden bench, a wall hung with ivy, and directly across, the windows of the adjoining building. Apartments. A memory stirred. He rose, turned on the small lamp beside the bed, and took a notebook from the top drawer of the nightstand. Inside, tidy mechanical entries, dates, clock models, notes on repairs. But occasionally, something else, personal, offhand. Feb. 19 Madame S. Late again. Complains about noise upstairs. R laughs, but doesn't disagree. She's lonely. March 3 Heard voices at 2 a.m. Rear building again. Not sure if fighting or just loud. He flipped forward. April 10th. Woman on bench in the courtyard again. Always, same time. 4 p.m. Doesn't move much. Just smokes Megret. Closed the notebook and stood again. The woman, the one Ribeiro saw. But never mentioned to Turno. Not Lemoyne. Someone else. A presence in the background. A shadow in his final weeks. Back in the street, the lamps burned yellow in the early evening murk. Megret stepped into the entrance of the building opposite, a tired six-floor walk-up with flaking walls and the lingering odor of old cabbage. The concierge was asleep, behind a glass window, her head resting on a folded magazine. He rang the bell gently. She stirred, startled, then straightened. Yes, Megret showed his badge, his tone gentle. Chief Inspector Megret, I'd like to ask a few questions. She squinted. Nothing wrong here, surely? No, not. Here, across the courtyard. Do you know who lives in the rear apartment, second floor, facing the Clockmaker's building? She frowned, thinking, that would be Madame Serre. Widow, quiet, keeps to herself. Been here, maybe 3 years now. Does she work? She's a seamstress, I think. From home, used to go out more. Not lately. Anyone visit her? Hardly. The grocer's boy, maybe once a week. No family I've seen. Megret nodded. She home now. The concierge shrugged. Probably, you'll have to knock. He thanked her and began to climb the stairs, his footsteps quiet on the worn treads. The hallway smelled of dust and varnish. On the second floor, he paused at a green-painted door, chipped around the handle, and knocked. A pause, then the sound of soft movement within. The door opened part way. A woman stood behind it, not old, not young, perhaps in her late 40s. Her hair was pulled back without care, and her face bore the weary marks of someone who had long stopped expecting. Surprises, yes. Madame Serre, she nodded cautiously. Chief Inspector Megret, may I come in? She hesitated, but then stepped aside. The apartment was modest. One room led into another. A pot of something long boiled over sat on the stove. Thread spools and fabric scraps cluttered the table. A cracked mirror hung beside the window, the same one Megret had seen from across the courtyard. He did not sit. You knew M. Ribeiro. Her eyes moved, but she didn't answer immediately. From across the way, Megret prompted, You've lived here some time. Her voice was flat. We never spoke, but you saw him. A shrug, I suppose. And he saw you. Enough to write about it. She looked at him then. He wrote about me. Megret didn't answer. Did you ever meet him? She hesitated. No, not properly. But you watched each other. Another silence. I saw him sometimes, she admitted. In the evenings, he'd be in the chair, reading. I liked the light in his room. It made mine seem ... less empty. Megret said nothing. Let her keep speaking if she would. I never meant anything by it. It wasn't a romance, just habit. You know how it is. The same people in the same windows. You start feeling like you know them. He nodded slowly. Did you see him yesterday? Yes. He was there in the chair. Around midday, anyone else? Her lips pressed together. There was someone. A man. Not the delivery boy. Older. He came out the back door, left quickly, didn't look back. Describe him. Dark coat. Limp, maybe. I only saw part of his face. What time was this? Just before 2. Maigret straightened. You're sure? I watched the clock. He believed her. On the way back down the stairs, Maigret lit his pipe and exhaled slowly. A man, not Lemoyne, not Turno. Someone older, limping, unseen, unmentioned, and most likely the one who had wiped the window pane, back at the Quai. Or favors, he summoned Lapointe. Find out who Reberol used to partner with before he retired. Another horologist, someone who might have shared the business or a rivalry. Lapointe took notes. Anything else? Yes, Maigret said, eyes distant. Check for men with a limp. It was the kind of morning Maigret had always associated, with slow work and long coffee. The sky was low and colourless. The rain had not yet returned, but the streets still shimmered with leftover damp, and the air felt like it might break into drizzle at any moment. Back at the Quai d'Orsay, the corridor was unusually quiet. Maigret sat in his office, the door ajar as always, a fresh pot of coffee on the side table and his pipe between his fingers, though unlit for the moment. Lapointe entered without knocking, his notebook already open. I found something, he said, without ceremony. Reberol used to work with a man named Louis Bernet. They had a shop together in the Marais, near Rue des Beignets. That was over 15 years ago. Maigret looked up, intrigued. Why did they part ways? Lapointe consulted his notes. There was some sort of falling out. I found a mention in an old trade registry. Something about a disagreement over a watch restoration. Nothing criminal. Just ... Bitter, Bernet started his own business after that. He ran a small workshop in Bolville until about 5 years ago, and now, Lapointe hesitated. He's still alive, retired, lives in a modest flat near Parc des Bouts, alone, and he has a limp. Maigret nodded slowly. Well done. He lit his pipe, savouring the first few puffs, and said nothing for a long moment. Did you speak to him? No, Chief. I thought you might want to do that yourself. Maigret stood and reached for his coat. Let's take a walk. They found Bernet in a 4th-floor walk-up, in a building that smelled of damp plaster and boiled cabbage. The flat was clean but sparse, a single room with a narrow bed, a tall grandfather clock in the corner, and several half-disassembled watches on the table. The door had been answered by the man himself, small, narrow-shouldered, with sharp grey eyes and a cautious expression. Yes, he asked, voice hoarse with age, but not frailty. Maigret showed his badge. Chief Inspector Maigret. This is Inspector Lapointe. May we come in? Bernet's eyes flicked between them, then toward the hallway as though expecting someone else to appear. I suppose, he said at last, stepping aside. They entered. Maigret noticed at once the limp, slight but pronounced, favouring the left. Leg a cane leaned against the wall near the table. We're here about René Reberol. Something in Bernet's eyes tightened. He's dead, isn't he? Maigret studied the man's face. Yes. A pause. How we were hoping. You might help us understand that. Bernet snorted, a bitter, breathless sound. I haven't seen René in more than a decade. You were partners once. For 10 years, maybe more. We built fine things, until he decided he no longer needed me. What happened? Bernet shrugged, as though the memory were more tiresome than painful. Pride. He thought I was careless. I thought he was rigid. Eventually, we both said things we didn't mean or meant too well. You had no contact after that. None. Maigret glanced at Lapointe. You weren't near the Rue des Trois-Bornes 2 days ago. Bernet's gaze sharpened. No. Why would I be? We have a witness who saw a man, limping, leaving the back of Reberol's workshop shortly before he was found dead. The silence that followed was long and dry. I didn't kill him, if that's what you're implying. Maigret didn't move. But you did visit him. Bernet's jaw worked. Once, last week. Why? Another pause. This one longer. I don't know. Nostalgia, perhaps. Or loneliness. Maigret said nothing. Bernet sighed. I heard through an old colleague that he was ill, that he was working less, keeping odd hours. I thought maybe it was time to speak again. We were never friends, but we'd known each other. That counts for something, doesn't it? What did he say when you arrived? He didn't throw me out, if that's what you're expecting. He was surprised, suspicious, but he let me in. We spoke. It was awkward. We both pretended not to remember the past. Did you argue? No, not that time. Maigret's eyes narrowed. But you came back. A flicker of hesitation. Bernet reached for the cane and sat down on the edge. Off the bed, yes, he said. I did. 2 days ago. Why? He wrote me a note. Told me he had something to give me. A watch. Said he had been keeping it for years. One of our old commissions. The first we made together, Lapointe. Wrote quickly. And did he give it to you? No. Bernet's eyes lowered. When I arrived, he was already ... gone. I let myself in. The back door was open. I called for him. Found him in the chair. You didn't call the police. I panicked. I thought if someone found me there, after all those years, with the way things ended, ... So you cleaned up, Bernet. Hands tightened. Not everything, just ... I wiped the glass he'd been drinking from. It had my fingerprints. I adjusted the clock. I didn't want it to look like I'd been there. I didn't kill him, Inspector, but I was a coward. I won't deny that. Maigret didn't speak. The small, ticking room seemed to shrink around them. Bernet's eyes were no longer defiant, only tired. You knew him well, Maigret said at last. Double quotes, yes. Was he the kind of man to end his own life? Bernet looked toward the grandfather. Clock in the corner, where the pendulum swung slowly, endlessly. He wasn't afraid of dying. But I don't think he wanted to die that day. Back at headquarters, Lapointe was subdued. You believe him? He asked. Maigret didn't answer immediately. He refilled his pipe, tamped it down, and stared at the rain-streaked window. Paris. Moved outside in its usual rhythm. Trams, bicycles, people passing under umbrellas, indifferent to the quiet unraveling of one old man's final days. He didn't lie well, Maigret said finally. That counts for something. But if he didn't do it, and neither did Lemoyne or Turneau. Maigret leaned back in his chair. Someone still hasn't spoken, he murmured. But they were there. I can feel it in the room, in the way things were left behind. Lapointe closed his notebook. Where do we look next? Maigret's eyes drifted to the small clock on his desk, ticking softly, precisely, as though it too were waiting for the truth to come out, second by second. Back to the silence, he said. Let's go back to the shop, one more time. The Rue des Trois-Bornes had changed little in the days since Ribeyrol's death. Perhaps the street looked a shade more curious now. neighbours glancing at the shuttered shop front as they passed, the way one might glance at a door that had once been friendly and now no longer answered, but the overall tone remained the same, faded, wet, waiting for nothing in particular. Maigret arrived alone this time. Lapointe had offered to accompany him, but Maigret had waved him off. The case was not about interviews anymore, not about timelines or testimonies. It was about the room, about presence. He opened the door with the same key, moved with the same familiar steps across the creaking floorboards. The clocks ticked, fewer than ever now. Some had simply wound down, their silence more eloquent than any mechanical rhythm. Did not light the overhead lamp. He used only the natural grey of the morning, which filtered weakly through the front window and into the narrow shop. The dust had begun to settle again. Even the air felt different. More honest, perhaps. He stood by the counter and looked again at the row of clocks on the right wall. One was missing. It was not something he had noticed immediately, because the change was subtle. But now that he looked properly, he saw the empty hook, the faint outline of dust around where the clock had once hung. A small thing, a brass carriage clock, no larger than a man's hand. Gone, not stolen, not in a hurry, removed deliberately. Perhaps during the night, he stepped into the back room again. The chair remained, though the police had removed the cushion and tested the upholstery. The glass of mark had been bagged and labelled. Even the carpet had been inspected. But Maigret had the sense, more than ever, that the scene had been staged, that someone had tried to make the silence speak for them, and in doing so had made it lie. He turned toward the curtain. It was a simple length of heavy fabric, hung to separate the rear room from the tiny alcove kitchen. In the bustle of the earlier searches, no one had paid it much attention, or if they had, no one had spoken of what was behind it. Maigret stepped to the edge and drew the curtain aside. Behind it stood a tall, narrow grandfather clock, older than the others and much plainer. Its face was cracked near the 8. The pendulum had long stopped. The casing bore faint scratches, and there was a small keyhole in the lower panel, locked. Maigret ran his fingers along the edge of the wood. There was a fine layer of dust, except near the base, where fingerprints had smeared it. Someone had opened it recently. He retrieved the master set of keys from his coat pocket. One by one, he tried them in the lock. On the 4th try, the latch gave a soft click. He opened the panel slowly. Inside, the pendulum hung still, and a small cloth pouch sat wedged into the bottom corner. Curious, carefully, Maigret lifted it out. It was heavier than expected. He untied the string and poured the contents into his palm. Tablets, pale blue uniform. No, labelled barbiturates. The kind that Dr. Paul had suspected had killed Ribeiro. Maigret stood very still. The pouch was worn, old, but the pills looked fresh, as if someone had been given them recently, or as if they had been hidden only days ago. He replaced the pouch, locked the panel and stepped back, staring at the face of the clock. Why here? Why this clock? Because no one paid attention to it. It was in the back, behind the curtain, long stopped, and useless to anyone but Ribeiro himself. A hiding place only someone familiar would think to use. He sat in the armchair, retracing in his mind the quiet choreography of the room, the way the chair had been turned, the glass placed to the right, the second hand on the clock frozen at 2:47, a portrait of a peaceful death. But what kind of man, in his final moments, hides the very thing that will end him? Unless he didn't hide it, unless someone else had put it there. Maigret was already reaching for the telephone by the time he returned to the station. Lapointe appeared in the doorway, surprised by the energy in the inspector's step. "You found something, yes?" Margaret said simply. "But I need confirmation. Get Dr. Paul on the line. Ask if the pills used were from a prescribed batch. Then get Turno. I want to speak with him again." Lapointe nodded and left quickly. Maigret lit his pipe, though he didn't smoke it. He paced instead, as though each step helped unravel something. Tight and knotted in his thoughts, the pieces were beginning to align, not like a jigsaw, but like a watch movement. Each gear turning into the next, each lie pushing at a silence. It was not Lemoyne and not Bernet. He had known that, and yet it was neither cold-blooded nor planned. It was born from something smaller, sadder. Lapointe returned 20 minutes later. "Dr. Paul says the pills match a common brand, luminol, but they weren't prescription. No pharmacy had issued them to Ribeyrol, so someone gave them to him. Yes, and I found Turno." Maigret didn't speak. He waited. He's disappeared. Didn't return to his usual sleeping place. The night porter at the shelter says he collected his things yesterday afternoon and didn't say where he was going. Maigret exhaled slowly. "He's running." Lapointe frowned. "You think he did it?" "No," Maigret said, "but I think he knows who did." He turned to the window, tapping his pipe against the sill. The Seine moved sluggishly below, brown and dull in the overcast light. "It was someone close," he murmured. "Someone who didn't want to kill him. Not really. Just help him. Make it easier." Lapointe spoke softly. "Lemoyne." "No. She couldn't even stay in the room." "Then who?" Maigret turned. "Who else would have access? Who knew the back of the shop? Who wouldn't be suspected, wouldn't even be noticed, moving behind the curtain, unlocking a clock?" Lapointe's eyes widened. "Madame Collard, the landlady." Maigret nodded. "She had the keys. She cleaned. She brought meals." She saw his decline. Lapointe was already reaching for his coat. Madame Collard looked surprised, but not alarmed, when they arrived. She wore the same apron, the same wool sweater with sagging cuffs. Her small eyes darted from Maigret to Lapointe, then back again. "Back so soon, Chief Inspector? I'm afraid we need to talk." She let them in without fuss. A black cat slinked under the radiator. They sat at the kitchen table. A kettle hissed on the stove. "We found something in Ribeyrol's back room," Maigret said gently. "Behind the curtain, hidden inside the tall clock." Madame Collard said nothing, but her hand just briefly clenched the edge of the table. "Barbiturates," he said. Enough to stop a heart. Her voice was very quiet. "He asked me." Maigret waited. "He said he didn't want to suffer, that the nights were long and the clocks kept ticking, and the silence felt too heavy. He was coughing blood. He couldn't sleep. He wasn't a man for hospitals. So you agreed." "I didn't know how else to help," she whispered. There was no defiance in her voice, only weariness. Not the weariness of guilt, but of carrying something too heavy for too long. "I didn't give him the pills all at once. I left the pouch. He said he'd know when." Maigret nodded slowly. "You didn't arrange the room." "No, I found him like that. I wiped the glass. I was ashamed." He said nothing more. Outside, the clouds shifted slightly, casting a paler light across the table. "Madame Collard," he said quietly, "you understand this must be reported." She nodded. "I expected you would." Stillness returned. Maigret rose, his coat hanging from his shoulders. the pipe still clenched between his teeth, though long gone out. The clocks, he thought, had finally stopped in the right place. By the time Maigret returned to his office, the rain had resumed, thin at first, like a suggestion, then heavier. The kind of rain that blurred street lamps and softened every sound into a murmur. From the window of the Quai des Orfèvres, Paris looked smudged and tired, its zinc rooftops streaked with fresh wetness, its people moving slower, hunched deeper into themselves. He closed the window part way to keep out the draught and sank into his chair. The silence of the office was comfortable now. The case was, in technical terms, complete. Madame Collard had been taken in without resistance. She'd said all there was to say, quietly, even kindly. No shouting, no denials, no drama. Just an old woman and a dead man who had trusted her enough to ask for the impossible. Maigret didn't feel satisfaction. He rarely did. What remained was a kind of resignation, the understanding that, once again, the truth had arrived without glory or punishment, but with a soft weight that settled behind the eyes and would remain there for days or weeks or perhaps forever. Lapointe came in with 2 cups of coffee, setting one down wordlessly before taking the chair opposite. Neither spoke for a while. The ticking of the office clock was the only sound. Even the phones had fallen silent for the moment. "She won't be charged with murder," Lapointe said eventually. "No," Maigret agreed. "Assisted suicide, maybe, but it won't go to trial. The magistrate will shake his head, ask a few questions, and then recommend leniency." She didn't seem afraid. She wasn't. He sipped his coffee, black and already going lukewarm. She'd already decided, I think, the moment she gave him the pills. They sat again in silence. After a while, Lapointe said, "I keep wondering why he didn't take them right away. If that's what he wanted." Maigret nodded. "That's the question, isn't it?" He got up and moved to the filing cabinet. From the bottom drawer, he retrieved the notebook they'd found beside Rebirol's bed. Still marked with neat handwriting, still filled with entries about broken gears, worn bearings, deliveries expected and never collected. He opened to the final page, blank. Maybe he wasn't sure, Maigret said. Or maybe he wanted to see who would come. Bernay, Lemoyne, Turneau, all of them. Perhaps he was measuring their visits like a clockmaker counts seconds, waiting to know which of them would arrive too late. Lapointe watched him, thoughtful. "You think he left the pouch there to test them?" "I think," Maigret said, "that he didn't want to die alone. But he also didn't want anyone to suffer for him, so he made his silence to tidy. A perfect stage. Everything cleaned, timed, arranged, as if to say, I did this. No one else. But it wasn't clean, no." Maigret smiled faintly. "Because life never is." He moved again to the window, pipe in hand, unlit. Below, the street shimmered with car headlights. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang out the hour, 4 o'clock. Maigret pictured the clocks in the workshop, each ticking a different rhythm, each one a little wrong in its own way. "Turneau still hasn't turned up?" he asked. Lapointe shook his head. "Not yet. We've passed his name to the shelters, the night patrols. He's not dangerous," Maigret said. "Just frightened." He let his gaze drift over the city, the rooftops slick and glistening, the chimneys issuing faint wisps of smoke. Somewhere out there was a man who had seen too much and said too little. A man who had tried to erase his presence, believing that silence was safer than honesty. Maigret understood that. To many people, he thought, feared that telling the truth would be worse than living beside it. That evening, Maigret walked home rather than taking a car. The rain had eased to a mist again, fine enough not to need an umbrella. His coat was thick enough. The walk took him through narrow side streets where the stone gleamed under footlamps, past shuttered cafes and bakery windows going dark one by one. When he reached Boulevard Richard Lenoir, the smell of wet earth and chestnuts drifted through the air. He passed a man closing a flower stall, the buckets clanging as they were dragged under the awning. The city seemed to breathe, slow and damp and tired. At home, Madame Maigret greeted him in her quiet way. She had stew on the stove and a tart. Cooling on the window-sill, they ate without speaking much. After dinner, he read the newspaper while she did the mending. Only once did she say something that made him pause. "You look tired," she said, not unkindly, "like you've been listening to someone talk in their sleep." He looked up from the paper. "In a way," he said. "Yes." They didn't speak of it again. The next morning Turno was found. He had turned up at St. Lazare station, sitting on a bench near the newsstand, soaked to the skin and trembling, a paper bag clutched in his lap. The night guard had recognized him from the bulletin and called it in. Maigret found him sitting alone in the holding room, his clothes smelling of rain and damp wool, his hands restless. A broken man, not dangerous, just misaligned with the world. "Didn't do anything," he said immediately, eyes wide. "I know," Maigret said gently. "But you ran. That always makes people ask questions." "I was scared." "Of what?" He hesitated. "That I had helped, even if I didn't mean to." Maigret sat across from him. "Tell me," Turno licked his lips. "He asked me if I could get something for him, something to help him sleep. I didn't think, he said he couldn't get a prescription. Just a few tablets. He didn't say what for." "Where did you get them?" "There's a man near the Gare de l'Est. Sells things, not dangerous things. Just pills, sometimes." I bought a handful. Gave them to Ribeyrol in a matchbox. I thought they were just for sleep." Maigret nodded. "You didn't know he meant to die?" Turno's voice cracked. "No." The inspector leaned back. "You gave him the means. But you didn't give him the will." Turno looked up, hopeful, but Maigret's face remained calm, unreadable. "You should have come to us," he added. "I know." He paused a moment. "Will I go to prison?" Maigret thought about it, then shook his head. "Probably not, but you won't come out of this unchanged." Turno nodded slowly. "I already haven't." Back in his office, Maigret closed the file. He didn't write a report yet. He simply left the folder on the corner of his desk and lit his pipe, drawing slowly as the scent of tobacco curled around the room. This was the part that no one ever understood, the part that novels got wrong. The conclusion was not triumph. It was not a satisfying click of pieces in a puzzle. It was sitting at a desk on a grey morning, the rain still tapping at the windows, and realizing that what had happened was not murder or mystery, but life, messy, quiet, inevitable. He stared out the window for a long time, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he could still hear the clocks ticking. There was one visit Maigret had yet to make. He knew it wouldn't alter the facts. Nothing the woman could say would change what had happened. And yet something in him, something older than logic, told him it was necessary, not for the case, but for the shape of it. Some investigations, he believed, could not be closed with paper and signatures alone. They needed to be walked through, felt, breathed, touched like a fabric held between finger and thumb. So, Late in the afternoon, under a sky so pale it was nearly white, he took a cab to Rue Boissonade. Claire Lemoyne lived in a clean, stone-faced building with iron balconies and flower pots arranged just so. Not elegant, but careful. The kind of place where curtains were drawn at the same angle across every floor. Maigret rang the bell and waited. A few seconds passed before the buzzer sounded. He climbed the stairs, slowly. She was waiting in the doorway when he reached the second floor. She was in the same grey coat, the gloves again neatly folded in one hand. Her hair had been redone since their last meeting, not to impress, perhaps, but out of habit. She didn't smile. "May I come in?" She nodded, stepping aside. The apartment was small, impeccable. A pair of armchairs in the salon, lace doilies on the armrests, a bookshelf filled with old medical encyclopedias, likely her husband's. The window was open slightly, letting in the soft sound of traffic far below. She gestured to a chair, but Maigret remained standing for a moment, glancing round the room. "It's very quiet here," he said. "My husband naps in the next room. He's unwell. I won't stay long." She sat, back straight, hands in her lap. Maigret lowered himself into the opposite chair. His eyes were kind, but steady. "I wanted to tell you that the case is closed." She didn't react. "Madame Collard has confessed. She supplied the pills. He hid them himself, in the clock behind the curtain." Still nothing. Only a slight flicker in her breathing. "We found out that Jules Tourneau had purchased the tablets for him, not knowing their purpose, and that Louis Bernet discovered the body and tried to make it look more ... peaceful." Her hands gripped each other faintly. "And me, you told the truth." Silence. Then she said, "He didn't want to die." "Alone," no, Maigret agreed. "And yet he made sure he would." She looked out the window, then back to him. "He had his reasons. He always did." Maigret studied her. "Did he love you still?" A pause. "I think so, in his way." "And you?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation, "but not enough to stay. Not enough to leave my husband and ruin whatever dignity remained for any of us." He nodded. "Did he ask you to help?" "No. But he wanted me to. I could feel it." She pressed her lips together. He had grown very small, Inspector. Not just in body, in spirit. He no longer believed in repair of anything. He stopped working on clocks. He sat, day after day, just listening to them, as if they were talking and he was the only one who understood their language. Maigret lit his pipe, but did not inhale. "Some people feel the weight of silence more than others," he said. She gave a slight, sad smile. Yes, there was no need for more. He stood and buttoned his coat. She didn't rise immediately. "Will they punish her?" she asked softly. "Madame Collard?" "No, she will be spoken to. That's all." Good Maigret nodded once and made for the door. Just as he reached it, she said, "Thank you for coming." He turned. "Why?" "To tell me what I already knew but needed to hear from someone else." He inclined his head gently and left without another word. Back on the street, the wind had picked up. It was not cold, but it moved in uneasy spirals, as if something were being stirred deep in the belly of the city. Maigret walked. He passed cafes beginning to fill for the evening, small clusters of students smoking and laughing under awnings. A grocer shouting something at his assistant across crates of melons. Life going on, all of it indifferent. He lit his pipe again. The case had not been about guilt, not really, nor crime. It had been about time, about decline, about the quiet accumulation of small losses, health, relationships, clarity. In the end, it wasn't even death that had been feared, but the manner of it, the isolation, the indignity. Ribeiro had died in his chair, head turned slightly, the room staged like a farewell note no one could read. He had asked nothing of the world in his final hours, not love, not forgiveness, only silence, and in that silence had found all the answers. When he returned to the office, dusk was creeping in. Lapointe was at his desk, reading through the week's reports. He looked up as Maigret entered. "All done?" he asked. Maigret nodded, hanging his coat on the peg. "Yes, you'll write the report. Tomorrow." Lapointe smiled faintly. "You say that every time." Maigret poured himself a small glass of beer from the bottle he kept in the cabinet. He offered one to Lapointe, who declined. They sat together in the office, the clocks ticking, the official ones and the imagined ones, those behind them in the case and those ahead, waiting to start again. "There's something about time," Maigret said quietly, "that we only understand when it's about to run out." Lapointe didn't answer. He just listened. The older man took a sip of beer, then leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. "It's never the crime that matters most," he continued. "It's the people around it, the ones who survive it, what it leaves them with. And what did this one leave?" Maigret took a long breath, a kind of sadness, but a quiet one, like when a clock stops and no one notices, not for hours or days, until suddenly they do. Lapointe watched him. There was something in Maigret's voice that felt closer to poetry than to policing, but he knew better than to say so. They sat a while longer, each in his thoughts. Outside, the rain began again. The rain returned in earnest the following morning. It came down straight and soft, not in sheets, but in a persistent hush that cloaked the city in a kind of waking dream. Paris had always looked its oldest in the rain, not worn but ageless. A city not aging forward, but slowly into itself. Maigret stood at his office window and watched it gather on the sill, beading along the iron railing like tears that had nowhere to fall. The file was on his desk. Closed, the report had been written. The night before, in his usual careful hand, but he hadn't yet signed it. Not out of doubt, but of reluctance, as if to put his name to the ending would be to admit that it truly was one. But there was no more to ask, no more to notice, no small corner still hiding a wordless answer. He turned from the window and lit his pipe, the smell of tobacco warming the air. He sat down, glanced at the folder, and pushed it slightly to the side. Instead, he opened his drawer and took out the pocket notebook Ribeirol's. He flipped to the middle. The entry he was looking for wasn't dated, but he remembered it all the same. "The ticking seems louder now. It fills the room I used to love it. Now I wonder what it's counting." A simple line, almost easy to overlook, but for Maigret, it captured everything, not just the man's death, but his living. The solitude, the routines, the deliberate smallness of his world. He read it once more, then returned the notebook to the drawer. There had been no great unraveling, no shouting across interrogation tables, no tearful confessions under hot lights, just a slow approach toward truth, like a tide creeping up a shore. Maigret had not chased this case. He had waited for it, like always, to come to him, and it had. Later that afternoon, he walked back one final time to the Rue des Trois Bornes. The crime scene had long been cleared, the body removed, the statements taken, the clocks catalogued and photographed, and yet Megrit wanted to see it again, not to inspect, but to inhabit. A kind of goodbye. He let himself in quietly. The shop was dark and damp, the shutters still drawn. Dust had already begun to settle again on the countertops, on the glass cases, on the faces of clocks whose tickings had faded into stillness. The room did not feel like a place of death. It felt like a place that had simply stopped. Megrit moved slowly along the walls, brushing his fingertips against the carved wood of the clock cases. Some of the pieces were modest, others handcrafted with loving detail. Each held a personality, a voice, and all of them silent now. He stood again behind the counter, just as Ribeirol must have done so many mornings, waiting. Perhaps not for customers, but simply for time to pass. Outside, the sound of footsteps in the wet street, the murmur of a radio from a distant window, and behind it all, the rain dot in the back room. The chair remained, not the cushion, not the glass, not the quiet theatre of death, but the chair, itself empty now, turned slightly toward the window, as if someone had risen only moments before. Megrit stood for a while without moving. He didn't sit, he let the moment breathe in his mind. He pictured the scene as it must have been, Ribeirol in his nightshirt, placing the pouch inside the tall clock, closing the panel, locking it. Perhaps he thought he would take the pills that night. Perhaps he decided to wait. And perhaps, after all, he never truly decided. The woman who brought him food, who straightened his room, who lingered sometimes longer than necessary, she had not killed him, not in anger or malice. She had only answered an unspoken request. An invitation, perhaps, or a surrender. Dot and Turno, drifting on the edge of things, had done what many do, acted out of confusion, of vague loyalty, of fear, none of them evil. Just human. Even Bernet, proud, brittle, carrying his limp like a badge of lost time, had come back, perhaps hoping to fix something, even if all he managed was to make the death look a little kinder than it truly was. Megrit drew a breath and turned from the chair. He closed the curtain that hid the grandfather clock, gently, reverently, as if to close the door not on a case, but on a man's life, the kind of life that would never make headlines, that would not be debated in cafes or echoed in courtrooms, a quiet, measured life, kept in ticking pieces. On his way out, he locked the door behind him. The sign above the shop still read R. Ribeirol, Horloger. The lettering, even more faded now, seemed ghostly against the damp facade. He lit his pipe and stood for a moment under the eave, watching the droplets cascade. From the edge of the awning, somewhere far off, a church bell rang the hour, 5 o'clock. The sound echoed gently between buildings before dissolving into the rain. Megrit walked slowly down the street, the way he always did after a case, his hands deep in his coat pockets, his thoughts not on facts, but on people. He did not think of Collard's confession or the statements Turno had given. He thought of the armchair turned slightly toward the window, of Lemoyne's folded gloves, of the woman across the courtyard who had watched a life fade from behind her own window pane. He thought, too, of what it meant to listen, to be still, to wait until the quiet revealed something deeper than speech. At home, Madame Megrit had set the table for two, a roast chicken, warm bread, the small ceramic dish she used for Dijon mustard. "You're early," she said, mildly surprised. Megrit nodded and hung his coat. "It's done." She didn't ask what it was. she never did. Instead, she brought him his plate, poured him a small glass of red wine, and sat across from him. They ate in companionable silence, the kind built over years of shared dinners and few wasted words. Only once did she speak, as he was buttering his bread. "You'll sleep well tonight." Margaret glanced up, amused. "You think so?" She shrugged gently. "It was a sad one. Those weigh on you." He nodded. "Yes, but sometimes the sad ones are the cleanest. They come with fewer illusions and fewer villains." Margaret smiled faintly. After dinner, he sat by the window with his pipe. The rain tapped against the glass with steady rhythm, not unlike a clock. No urgency, number, drama, just time slipping forward, second by second, in the street below. A boy was walking with his father, stomping through puddles with quiet delight. Across the way, a light flickered on in a neighbor's apartment, and behind it all, as always, Paris endured, still ticking, still waiting, still watching, silently like Margaret.